Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on designing for EPBD, Whole Life Carbon Disclosure and Limits in Construction Projects, hosted by One-Click LCA. In the next hour, we'll cover what the regulation requires, including disclosure rules, carbon targets, and timelines, with practical examples to help project teams prepare. We are glad to have you with us and look forward to the discussion. This webinar is brought to you by One-Click LC, the world's largest lifecycle assessment platform, delivering impact, compliance, and growth in over 170 plus countries. It combines the in-depth modeling capabilities of SEMA Pro with the ease of use and scalability of One-Click LCA. The platform includes the most comprehensive global LCA database with more than 500,000 datasets and supports customers across manufacturing, construction, infrastructure, chemicals, and consumer goods supply chains. One-Click LC is committed to empowering 1 million makers of zero carbon future by 2035, driving impact at a planetary scale. Today, we are joined by Paul Astle, Building Decarbonization Lead at Rembol, who has spent over 13 years advancing sustainable design and supporting more than 4,000 designers in decarbonizing built environment. Thank you, Paul, for joining us.
Thank you.
And Mario Stikos from One-Click LCA is an expert in LCA, BIM, and sustainability, advising clients across Europe on regulatory compliance and embodied carbon reduction. We are so delighted to have you both with us today. Let's begin. Over to you, Paul.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Asha. Really happy to be here this morning and very glad to talk about this topic. As you have said, my job is decarbonization lead for Rembol Buildings. So it's my role to try and support all of our building designers around the world to decarbonize our designs and support our clients. I'm going to focus in on specifically the carbon assessment elements of the EPBD, and Marius is going to pick up on that as well. So just a quick word about Rembol. We are a large engineering architecture consultants with a global presence, as you can see on the screen, with more than 18,000 people. We are headquartered in Denmark, and therefore we have a very large presence in Europe. And of course, therefore, the EPBD, as well as other regulations, are really fundamental to what we're doing and how we support our clients. So that's one of the reasons why we've been looking at this very carefully. And again, very happy to be here this morning to discuss the impacts that we think we need to be prepared for as an industry. So just a very brief recap on the impact of buildings in the EU. So it'll come as no surprise that they have a significant impact. You know, 40% of energy consumed in the EU is in buildings. Over a third of the energy-related GHG emissions also come from buildings, and between 5 and 12% of emissions are associated with material extraction, manufacture, and renovation of buildings. That's the embodied carbon, and that's one that often is missed in recent years, but it's something that we've got to be addressing as well. So collectively, a really significant impact from buildings in the EU, and we've got to do something about it if we're going to meet our carbon targets. Now, in terms of where we need to be, what we want to have is a fully decarbonized existing stock. Most of the buildings in the EU will continue to be around, beyond 2050. So we need to make sure those existing buildings are decarbonized. We need more reuse and refurbishment. We don't have the carbon budget to rebuild all the time. We, of course, need to have very low whole life carbon new construction where we do require new buildings. And we need mandatory and consistent carbon measurement and assurance to make sure we're all working to the same rules and we're all working towards the same goal. That's not where we are today. We have a really huge variation in the performance of existing stocks, some very poor quality leaky buildings, some very efficient buildings. Some reuse is happening in pockets of the EU, and there's some really great examples, but they're still quite rare. There's been a focus on operational performance of new construction, which has been very important, but now we need to embrace this idea of whole life carbon in new construction as well. And there is actually a huge variation in carbon measurement and quality. We see big differences in the methodologies, not only between different member states, but sometimes within those member states, as well as varying qualities. So we need to address that if we're going to have this consistency that we need to deliver low carbon future. And that's the purpose of the EPBD, the recast EPBD, which was published last year. It's recast because it's largely rewritten, and it includes a whole range of different elements to tackle all of these different challenges. Now, today we're just going to focus in on the whole life carbon element, but it is worth being aware of some of the other things as well that are captured in there that look at renovation as well as energy performance too. But if we just focus in on those carbon assessment requirements, there's three fundamental things that it's important to be aware of. First of all, there's a requirement to measure and disclose life cycle GWP. Secondly, there's the requirement to have a target and limit value for GWP. And finally, there's also the requirement to adopt a common approach to that calculation. So three different elements there, which collectively really seek to address a lot of those challenges related to carbon. And just in case you're not so familiar with that term, life cycle GWP, we also often refer to as whole life carbon. And just for information, the disclosure of those carbon performance will be in the energy performance certificate of the building. So whilst we may be used to seeing EPCs in relation to their energy performance, the operational performance, we're going to start seeing them including carbon as well. So it's going to become a really important document when we're looking at buildings too. Now, all of this isn't going to happen overnight. There's a carefully set out time frame. We had the EPBD, as I mentioned, published last year. By the end of this year, the EU will publish their framework for national calculation. So this is the baseline for how to calculate to meet the EPD rules. And this is really important because we have this real big challenge right now where different countries and methodologies create quite a lot of confusion when we're trying to look at the performance. That will set up the minimum rules, and then some countries may go beyond that, but that will be the minimum rules, and I'm really looking forward to that coming out. And then at the beginning of 2027, we're going to see national roadmaps published. So every member state will need to set out how they're going to meet the carbon ambitions of the EPBD, and then they're going to have to set out the limit values as well, although that can come a bit later. But what this means is that over the next 12 to 15 months, all member states are going to be working very hard to do some research and baseline the carbon in their new construction in order to set that roadmap out. So lots of things happening there for that. And then by the beginning of 2028, we'll have a requirement for disclosure of carbon in large new buildings, so those over 1,000 square meters. And then by 2030, all new buildings will need to disclose life cycle GWP, but also comply with the limit values as set out in their country roadmaps. So there's quite a lot happening. It maybe seems like a little bit of time till 2030, but actually, when we look at the number of changes that need to happen in the industry, that's a short time frame. So there's going to be a lot of exciting but challenging changes to come. Now, not all countries are starting from scratch on this. Some of them are ahead of the game, as it were. So Denmark, the Netherlands, and France have already got limit values in place. In fact, Denmark is in its second version. I'll come on to that in a second. Other countries have already got disclosure rules in place, or they're about to come into force with limit values to follow. So, things are moving in the right direction, but the vast majority still need to significantly roll out different levels of both disclosure and limit value rules. If we just dive in for a second on Denmark, as I mentioned, Ramboll is headquartered there, and so we have a big interest in how the rules are going to be implemented in Denmark. This is the second version of Denmark's rules already. So they brought out limit values in 2023, and they've tightened them just a few months ago over the summer as well. Those tightened limit values now include more buildings and they include more scope as well. And you can see some of the numbers on the right of the screen there, and they're quite challenging, really. We're talking around 7.5 kilograms of CO2 per square meter per year for all carbon in that building over its life. So really quite tight limit values. And what we found is that with these new rules, 85% of new construction buildings would need to be better than they currently are. So that really is trying to lift an enormous block of design practice and performance from where it is today to meet the rules in the future. So really significant change. Now we've done even a bit more research on this because we wanted to understand what would happen to the buildings that we've already designed. So we published a white paper which is available on our website, where we've taken 5 existing Ramble projects and we've retrospectively looked at them as to see what would happen if we were to apply the existing, or so the new rules to those projects. And what we found is that actually we can meet the new rules if we use best practice materials and if we try and use lots of substitution. There was a few things that struggled, so single-story buildings were quite difficult, as well as logistic buildings too. But the reality is it's not really practical for all of those projects to have used those materials because there simply won't be enough, or there'll be a lot of commercial challenges to do with single supplier usage. So the reality is that actually, in order to meet these kind of rules, we need to be doing things at a much earlier stage. We need to be doing different design approaches and trying to work out how we can meet those rules without just substitution of materials at the end. So in summary, we think that the greatest way to make these reductions is not going to be substitution, it's in the materials that we don't use. And that's going to be through things like reuse, using reclaimed elements, as well as lean design. So it is possible and it can be delivered, but actually design changes are quite important really to make this practical and scalable for the future. In France, they've had rules in place since 2022 covering some typologies, and they've really started to see an impact in the industry as well. In a recent survey, they found 3/4 of the industry, that's contractors, consultants, or suppliers, are reporting that decisions are being made differently because of these rules now. So people are really going to the supply chain, they're asking how things can be done, what options there are. So it's starting to have an impact. It's also spurred the generation of a huge number of new EPDs. It's very confusing with EPBD and EPDs, but it's spurred a huge number of EPDs, which are more rigorous than they were in the past, and that's also very important. We'll come on to that later. It isn't without challenges though, and they're still finding that to include carbon assessment on their projects, it's adding between 4 and 7 days of work to carry out that carbon assessment. And although that might not be too bad for a large project, for small projects, that can be a significant burden to overcome. So we do need to do more work on improving the automation, perhaps using AI, but certainly the automation wherever we can, and the links and interoperability between LCA, BIM, and EPDs to try and reduce that burden as much as possible. So it is happening, but we need to make it a little bit easier if we're going to scale this across Europe. Now, just to sort of pull all those things together and summarize a few of the points on what's going to happen, what the impact's going to be. First of all, there's going to need to be an explosion in the demand for carbon assessments because we have thousands of new buildings across the block which are going to need to disclose their carbon assessments in the coming years. So 2028, all large buildings, and by 2030, all buildings will need to disclose their carbon uh, measurements. So really significant demand coming. I think the reality is we can't meet that demand right now. There's going to be some real challenges in the skills and the ability to deliver it. And so this is where we're going to need a lot more automation, as I mentioned, maybe some AI or digital tools, which are going to allow people to meet those regulations, to provide the carbon assessments without massively increasing the burden, and frankly, just being able to deliver them at all within the skills that we have. We need lots of carbon data. So none of that carbon assessment will be possible without the associated carbon data on the for each material in each different country. So we're going to see a lot more demand for EPDs as well, and also I think more rigorous EPDs too. So there's going to be a real push to generate that data. We're going to hopefully have some standardization. One of the things I talk about a lot is the challenges we face working internationally, trying to compare projects in different countries. But I really hope that with the new rules coming out at the end of the year and the general movement and alignment in the EU, it will allow us to standardize the approach taken to measure carbon in buildings and hopefully even influence the global approach as well. So that is something which we all need. The disclosure is going to be really powerful as well. In Rambo, we've been disclosing our carbon assessments on a public platform, which you can access if you Google compare. And this has given people insights to see where carbon is and to understand perhaps what the best decisions are when it comes to carbon. This is something which I think we're going to see a lot more of. I hope we're going to see countries in a position where they can share all kinds of data sets and really help to spur the industry and identify where the carbon hotspots are and the best decision making. And finally, to meet limit values, we can't do this just with new materials. So new materials are going to be great and we're going to be able to substitute things with the lowest carbon materials, but that isn't going to be enough. We're going to have to change design. That means more reuse, maybe reclaimed elements, as I said, or indeed lean design and different approaches. So it's going to be a little bit scary, to be honest, if you're used to designing things conventionally, but actually it's also a real exciting time and a big opportunity for designers that embrace that, the ingenuity that we can offer to solve those problems. So a little bit scary, but also a bit exciting. And if I just pull this together in summary, EU buildings are a major source of GHG emissions, both from the operational side and also the embodied carbon side. And we've got to tackle that if the EU is going to meet its carbon goals. The updated EPBD provides a really comprehensive approach. As I said, we're talking about the carbon assessment piece today, but do read other parts of it because it's got a really good set of regulations covering other elements too. The most important thing to recognize is that it includes requirements to limit life cycle GHG or whole life carbon, as well as actually measure the carbon in all those buildings. There's going to need to be a huge increase in carbon assessment capacity and the data that supports that increase. And by 2030, all new buildings are going to need to have carbon assessments and to meet the limit values. So really significant change coming in the next 4 to 5 years, not long at all. And finally, lower carbon materials are going to be important. They're going to help, but they're not going to solve the problem alone. And so you've got to be prepared to change how we design buildings. So I hope this was useful and a good overview for you, and look forward to the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Really nice summary. And like you said, you have to start preparing now if you want to comply real soon. So now over to Marios. He'll talk a bit more about compliance in detail and how one-click LC can help in complying with EPBD. Over to you, Marios.
Thank you, Masa. Thank you, Paul. Great summary, Paul. Let's now have a quick look at the details, like the detailed requirements of the EPBD, and how what are the specific requirements in order to comply with the whole life carbon assessment criteria of the EPBD. A few more words about the EPBD, which was updated last year, as mentioned by Paul. It was updated by focusing in these 4 areas: renovation, decarbonization, modernization and digitalization, financing and technical assistance. Today we will be focusing on renovation and decarbonization because both of those areas, they are related to decarbonizing the building stock in Europe. Starting with renovation, there's going to be a renovation wave, let's say, in the next few years, and this is something that the EPBD is trying to initiate by requiring each EU country to develop its own national building renovation plan, which will basically mandate how this renovation wave will be implemented, what will be required, and in general, how are we going to achieve to a zero energy building stock across Europe. So there will be requirements for the non-residential building, like what kind of buildings will be prioritized and how much they need to be improved, both non-residential and residential. For non-residential buildings, the requirements are a bit more specific. This means that they require for the 16 worst performing buildings to be renovated by 2030 and the 26% to be renovated by 2033. With the residential building stock, it's a bit more flexible, but we still require to reduce the primary energy by 16% by 2030 and 20 to 22% by 2033, which means that the EU countries will be able to define their own roadmaps, let's say, but they have this incentive to focus or prioritize the worst performing because that's the best and easiest and fastest way to achieve these goals by 2030 and 2033. When it comes to decarbonization, um, zero emission buildings are becoming the new standard from now on. We want all public new buildings by 2028 to be zero emission and zero energy buildings. The same for any other new building by 2030. And then by 2050, we want every single building, like the entire building stock in Europe, to be zero energy building. All new buildings, they will have to be solar ready, which means they have to have the infrastructure in place to accommodate the installation of technologies like solar thermal and photovoltaics. Fossil fuel boilers will be phased out gradually, starting with stopping the subsidies from governments already this year. And then we also have the mandatory calculation of the whole life carbon emissions, which is what we will be focusing today. This means calculating and reporting the operational carbon emissions, just like we have been doing so far, plus the embodied carbon emissions. This is basically a quick repetition of what Paul has already presented before, starting with the zero energy buildings and what are the different steps. So we start with all new buildings requiring PVs or accommodate PVs in the future. Then we've got all the new public buildings to be zero energy buildings by 2028, all buildings being zero energy buildings by 2030. And then this is where we basically start this renovation wave, as we said. So we're starting renovating the existing buildings as well. So we have defined how we want new buildings to be, which is like the new standard. But now we need to start work on the existing buildings as well, with the aim for all of them to be zero energy buildings by 2050. And focusing on today's topic, which is whole life carbon assessments or global warming potential or life cycle assessments. There are many different terms out there that are being used. Essentially, it is the same thing. So we are calculating the carbon emissions across the entire life cycle of the building, from the raw materials extraction to the deconstruction of the building. We've got the updated or we are expecting an updated methodology by the end of this year that will tell us exactly how we need to do these life cycle assessments or whole life carbon assessments. Currently, the EPBD says do it according to the levels framework or according to an already existing regional methodology and according to the European standard for building LCAs, which is the EN 15978. But we still need to know a bit more detail on how to do things in a consistent way across the continent. So this will hopefully happen by the end of this year, according to the plan. And then each country is required to publish its roadmap on how to implement this directive, which means an adaptation of the EPBD directive into the national building regulations. They will also need to come up with limit values, meaning what is the set performance target for all new buildings from now on, not exceeding, let's say, the 7 kilos of CO2 equivalent per square meter, what Denmark is doing right now or has been doing for a few years, and several other countries are already working on it. Then from 2028, these updated regulation, national regulation, then will come into force for all new buildings that are above 1,000 square meters. And then from 2030, every other building, like literally any new building will have to undertake a life cycle assessment together with the energy performance analysis. Yeah, a breakdown of the LCA requirements of the EPBD directive. We need to calculate global warming potential, so we don't look into other indicators, only look into carbon emissions, which is what matters the most right now. And yeah, this is what we want to handle to avoid the climate catastrophe. Then we've got the results that must be reported in kilos of CO2 equivalent per square meter of useful floor area across a 50-year reference study period, which aligns with best practice right now. All these assessments will be done according to the European standard for buildings, the 15978. The scope of this assessment will be the same as with the levels framework, but more on that and a clarification we expect by the end of the year. Current national tools or methods that already comply with all the above requirements may also be used. But again, this is also something that will be clearer at the end of the year when we will have when we will be able to see the latest update of the exact methodology. So we will then know which regulations currently in what countries are aligning with this latest methodology. And when it comes to levels, because we mentioned it already, the levels framework, you can imagine it as a rating scheme, but not exactly rating, but it follows pretty much the same structure. The only difference is that it doesn't award credits or points like other rating schemes, for example, BREEAM, LEED, DGNB, and so on. This means that it is voluntary. It was created or developed by the European Commission as a guidance for any design team to follow or any client that wants to verify their building according to levels. It might be mandatory in some cases, for example, for taxonomy requirements when this is required, because it also depends on the type of the company and the size. And then it is also based on some macro objectives, as we will see right here. So this is basically the foundation of levels. Similar to the BREEAM and LEED categories, for example, we've got 6 macro objectives for GHG emissions across the building's life cycle, resource efficiency, material efficiency, circularity, water resources, healthy and comfortable spaces, adaptation and resilience to climate change, and finally, optimized life cycle cost and value. Today, we're focusing on the first macro objective, which is about carbon emissions along the entire life cycle of the building. And as the name of the framework suggests, it is all the different macro objectives. They are basically organized into 3 different levels. For the indicator 1.2, which is about measuring the GHG emissions or carbon emissions, we've got a full LCA that can be done with all 9 indicators if we want, but this is optional. But as a minimum, we need to include the global warming potential, which is what is required by the EPBD. And for the purpose of comparability, we need to align with the minimum scope of building elements. So we need to always include a certain amount or certain types of elements in our assessment, for example, the columns, the beams, the slabs, and so on. And there are also some data quality related requirements. So we all use the same level of quality, let's say, of data. And this is strictly EN 15804 EPDs or environmental product declarations. For those of you that are not familiar, EPDs, you can imagine them as a carbon assessment, life cycle carbon assessment of a product. So instead of a building that we're talking right now, it is done for a product, for example, for a 1 cubic meter of concrete, or 1 kilo or 1 ton of steel, or 1 square meter of plasterboard, and so on. So these data, then we can use them in our building LCAs. So how do the different levels look like? We've got level 1, which is basically something that we do at concept design. So that means that we need to do some kind of hotspot analysis, identify what contributes the most, so that we know where to focus in the next design stages. And in this case, Carbon Designer 3D can help with doing that, because you can do some comparative analysis very, very quickly. Then we've got level 2, which is a proper or detailed life cycle assessment at the design stage. And in this case, we've got all these different requirements that we mentioned before, with the service life and the data quality requirements and the indicators and so on. And we need to do some optioneering at this stage, options appraisal, compare different design options, and choose and identify some carbon reduction strategies. I will skip that because I see that we are a bit behind the schedule. So life cycle stages that we need to assess. We've got the different modules, like the product stage, which is the manufacturing of the products, the actual construction process itself, the use stage, and finally the end of life of the buildings. So all these needs to be included in our life cycle assessments. And then we've got the level 3, which is the same as level 2, but the main difference is that we're doing it post-construction. So we know the exact quantities of materials, we know the exact materials and the APDs that come with them. So we do a more accurate LCA, let's say. In terms of the physical scope, like what kind of elements we need to include, this is pretty much the entire building. So obviously the foundations, the load-bearing frame, the non-bearing elements like internal walls, and the slabs, the entire facade, the roof, parking elements. And then we've got energy systems like heating, cooling, and electricity systems, ventilation systems, and other utilities in the exterior and the hard landscaping as well. We need to report things in a certain way, which is quite simplistic in this case, because we're only looking to one indicator, and there doesn't seem currently, at least, to be the need for use of any classification system. So it makes reporting a bit easier as well. So global warming potential, the 3 different types of global warming potential for the different life cycle stages. As we said, all the data must be EN 15804 plus A2 compliant, which is the latest version of the European standard for the product EPDs, or construction product EPDs more specifically. And then there's also like a smaller exercise that we need to do, which is about the data quality index, which needs to be calculated, which will give less or more confidence to whoever reads these results about the quality of the data that have been used. But more of that probably in a different session. So compliance in practice, very, very quickly. We're not going to do an actual demonstration because we don't have enough time, but just showing some snapshots of the type of the tools and features that are available. So in one-click LCA, we already cover all the different regulations related to LCA in Europe, where these exist. For example, Denmark, as we mentioned, Sweden, Finland, France, and so on. And we also have a levels compliant tool that can be used in any other country. We've got Carbon Designer 3D, which is an early stage tool that you can use at the concept design stage to do some optioneering, as we said, when you at the stage where you don't really have much data. All you know is, for example, the total area of the building and the number of floors above ground and the type of the building and the location, where you define the scope in a very rough way. Let's say, for example, foundations, ground slab, the structure, the finishes, the services, and so on. And then the tool is able to apply to make some assumptions initially, depending on all this information and the location of the building, on what type of materials are being used in that region, and do also an estimate of the material quantities. And this way generate an example geometry for you, and also give you the results, which you can then use, make a copy of those models, and start making some changes at this initial stage. For example, changing the frame from one type to the other, or the slabs from one type to the other, to see how they compare with each other, and identify where you will need to focus from this point onwards. So not that much for an accurate assessment, but more for a comparative one. Then for levels 2 and 3, we've got the various different tools, the regional tools, but also the levels tool that comply with all the different requirements. They allow you to use any EPD according to the standards. For example, as we see here, we've got a list of various different EPDs from different countries. They automate the reporting for you in the required way for the regional methodology or levels. It allows you to do optioneering, compare different designs, compare different products. We've got the materials compass, a new tool that allows you to find lower carbon products in your region using this feature right here, and also compare them in more detail if and when needed. And with that, handing over back to Asa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marius. That was a very comprehensive overview of EPBD and how we can comply. Yeah, like Paul and Marius mentioned, the EPBD brings big changes, and every project team will feel the impact a little differently based on the type of work that you're doing. So if you would require any guidance on how these requirements will affect your own projects, you can click yes in the poll that pops up right now, and one of our experts can follow up with you to discuss how the regulation applies to your specific context. We also offer a course on the recast EU EPBD, and you can learn how to report whole life carbon GWB using one-click LC. The moderators, Stephen and Melina, will drop the links so you can enroll for the course if you'd like. We'd also like to take a moment to invite you to one of our upcoming live product release, especially built for carbon compliance. It's very relevant in terms of EPBD. It's happening on 16th October at 3 p.m. CET. And during this session, you'll get a first look at our AI-powered tools that especially help you to stay ahead of evolving regulations like EPBD, CPR, and CBAM. The event will also have a live demo, insights from our experts, and you can also ask your questions live. So don't miss out and register for the event. We also have other very educative online LC and EPD bootcamps that will be held this November. This will run from Monday to Thursday, 3 p.m. CET, and 2 hours per session. They are very interactive, practical, and designed to give you the skills that you need to meet these regulations, respond to your client requirements, and you also get a certificate. So please go ahead and register. Now let's go on to the very interesting part, the live discussion with Marius and Paul. So the first question I think is very relevant to you, Paul. It's about achieving net zero and limit values. So how can project teams move forward to the net zero targets while meeting the limit values, for example, those already set in Denmark?
Well, I think that the first thing to do is to get a handle on the carbon in the typical buildings that are being designed, and understanding, where are those carbon hotspots? What can we start with first? We should certainly target the easiest things first. So I would encourage design teams, depending on where they are in this level of maturity, but certainly to really make sure they're familiar with the typical values associated with different parts of a building, and then to start looking at what opportunities there are in their local region for replacing those or to displace them in some way. So I think the first thing is to really build that carbon literacy, and then understand the opportunities, and they will be different depending on where you are as well. We certainly know that in parts of the Nordics, there's a very different situation because the operational grid is much lower, and that means that your whole life carbon operationally will be lower, which might give you a little bit more embodied carbon. Whereas in other countries, the limit values will be different because the operational grid's higher, and then there'll be a sort of different influence on the embodied carbon as well. But I think it's a case of getting to know the carbon in your area, and I think as the different member states roll out their roadmaps in the coming year or so, we'll also get some really good insight on what's going on. So, it's getting aware first, I think.
Thanks, Paul. Marius, do you want to look at it from design strategies or the choice of products and materials? Would you like to add something to what Paul said?
Yes. Yeah. I first want to echo that. Yeah, it will take some time, and the very first step is literacy. So we all need to become familiar with this thing first, because it's going to be a new thing for like thousands of engineers and architects in Europe, especially in some countries. So we first need to familiarize ourselves with this process, and then everything will come in place. In terms of practical guidance, it is very important to start early, because this is when you can actually make a difference. So don't wait until decisions have been made and the design has been progressed and the drawings have been developed to suggest or look into reducing carbon emissions. This has to start at the very beginning, because it's cheaper and simpler and faster. So there are different things that you can look into at different design stages. So at the concept design stage, or even before concept design stage, is the time you can look into the geometry with a tool like the Carbon Designer 3D that we looked before, that generates some rough geometry and it gives you some baseline results. Then you can, for example, compare geometries like a 5-story building with that X footprint, or another 2-story building with a different footprint and different shapes and so on. This is a time. Once this is fixed, you cannot change it. Moving on, once the shape has been fixed, you need to start looking into the bigger items. And the bigger items are always foundations, the structural frame, and the slabs. You fix those, and this will allow the rest of the design team to keep working with defining like the internal spaces and the facades and all these kind of things. And while they are doing it, you need to start looking into smaller things like what would be the build-up of the facade, what are the different options that the architect is considering. Get those options from the architect, compare them with each other, send them over to them together with the client, and all together decide what needs to be done. And as you move on, you'll be able to make more accurate assessments and more accurate projections of what will actually be your carbon footprint. And are you on the right path, let's say, to comply with your national regulation? If not, you need to make a step back and reconsider things that you have already decided, which might come with some additional time and cost, which is why we want to start as early as possible. And then as we move on again, once everything has been defined in terms of the type of materials and the type of constructions, we need to start looking into products. And this is something that we can definitely do right now, more for some countries than others, because there is an abundance of EPDs, which is the LCAs for projects, for those not familiar. So all these data exist. They exist in one-click LCA, and you can compare them with each other and identify and specify the right or low carbon product. And this demand will also get the other manufacturers in all other countries to generate those EPDs as well. So it will enable the consultants and the designers to run this exercise. So it is a circle, basically. The one enables the other or incentivize the other.
Thanks, Marius. Yeah. As you were talking about materials, maybe I have another question regarding circularity. So how can one-click LC make it easy for to manage and account for secondhand or reuse materials within LCAs?
Yes, that is definitely something that can be done. I mean, it is something that we have been getting questions from a lot of our users, because as these limit values are being introduced, or the existing ones are becoming stricter and lower, let's say, using second-hand materials or reusing existing materials or entire, elements and structures is one of the ways that we will be able to achieve this. There are ways, there are lots and smaller features in one-click LCA that will allow you to, for example, avoid taking into account the A1 to A3 impacts, for example. So if you're reusing an existing structure and then you just expand the building with new elements and so on, that part of the building you don't really need to take into account, but you might have some replacement impacts in the future. So this is something that you can definitely do in one-click LCA. You just mark those materials as existing. You mark them as existing in place or existing coming from offsite, so you can take into account the transportation impacts as well if needed, and then whether you will be replacing these with a new material or not in the future. There are some details right there, but yeah, they can all be sorted using one-click LCA for sure.
Thank you, Marius. To wrap it up, Paul, what will compliance with EPBD look like in practice in 2028?
Well, in 2028, it's disclosure for large buildings. So it's going to be, detailed carbon assessments to make sure that we're in accordance with the methodology and disclosure of those on EPCs. I'd like to think it also would involve people getting ready for the compliance of the limit values as well, if they're not enforced yet. And, to sort of echo some of the Marius's suggestions, it's about, going back to the early stage of design and looking for opportunities, because I think if we don't act before 2030, it'll be very difficult to try and suddenly implement a whole range of efforts to reduce carbon. So I think it will look like carbon assessment certainly, but also the preparation to save carbon in the quickest way possible. So yeah, it'll be an exciting time.
Thank you. Really nice insights, and thanks for summing it up. Now it's the moment you have all been waiting for. We begin our live Q&A to answer all your questions. I know there's a lot of questions that's coming up. We'll try to answer as much as we can within the time. So the first question is from Phil. How will the EU framework for national calculation of the life cycle GWP avoid conflicting with the national methodology already in force in some of the member states, for example, Denmark? Paul, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that the framework that's coming out is really setting the foundation of the calculation methodology. There will be the option to go more detailed within that framework. So it shouldn't necessarily be a conflict. It hopefully will work together. There may be a few things in the EU methodology which aren't commonly included in a national methodology, and there may need to be some adjustments, but I don't expect it to be dramatic, really. It's more a case of just harmonization and making sure we're all starting on at least the same foundation when it comes to the calculation. So there may be some small adjustments, but I don't expect anything huge to change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next question is from Anna Maria. So she's asking, do we need to wait for 2027 to have a minimum GWP value with respect to new construction?
Well, absolutely not. So that's these regulations are the minimum, right? They're not the where we want to be. So they are to bring up everyone in the industry to a certain level. But if we're only meeting those, then actually we're not really leading. So by all means, we should be setting carbon targets all the time today. And in Ramble, we set internal targets already for all of our buildings. So certainly we should be trying to aspire to targets today, because actually that's how you focus attention on where the carbon is, and try to make efforts. So if you're in a position to set a carbon target, do it today. You don't need to wait until the regulations come out.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Next question is from Hannah. Is it already becoming apparent that there will be thresholds for the proportion of products in the overall building below which the products do not have to be taken into account in the building LCA? Did you get the question, or do you want me to repeat it once more?
I guess this has to do with making sure that whether like all the right materials have been considered in the LCA, like the cutoff rules or something like that. Did I understand correctly?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, I mean, there are standards already in the industry. I mean, BREEAM has some standards, and Vision, which is an infrastructure LCA, has its own standards. I think we will have to wait until the update of the methodology in the end of the year to see if there's going to be any cutoff rules. But I'm hoping that there will be something to guide like member states in their adaptation of the methodology. I don't know if Paul has any different insight on this.
No, I agree. I think we unfortunately do need to wait until those calculation methodology comes out, and I imagine there will be some degree of threshold cut off for what you do and don't have to include, and at what point it becomes unnecessary to include. I mean, I think what's important as well, I should say, is that we don't get too carried away with the minutiae of the rules for measuring carbon, because actually you don't necessarily need to know all those things to save carbon. So although those things are going to be very important, the key is to tackle the biggest source of carbon as quickly as we can. So we'll look at the rules, but let's not let the rules and the assessment cloud our main focus, which is just to reduce carbon, is what I would say.
Thank you both. Next question we have from Deb. Is EPBD expected to be adopted in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, to my knowledge, there's not a plan to do that. I think we might end up adopting, sort of not adopting, but we may have similar regulations from different parts of the EPBD, but they won't be called that. So there was a consultation or a document published just in summer in the UK, which sought to assess the cost to the industry of including carbon assessments in the building regulations. And I would assume that's a forerunner really to do that piece of work. So I imagine in the next, I mean, I don't want to say for certain, but I imagine in the next sort of 18 months to 2 years, perhaps, the UK will be looking to include some kind of carbon assessment in its building regulations, perhaps. And then there may be other parts of the EPBD which get picked up in different regulations separately. But I don't think we're intending to adopt it in its current form.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Elizabeth. What about increasing the use of wood and other bio-based building materials, also for the long-term capture of CO2 in the building? How does this biogenic carbon capture get a fair spot in the assessments?
Do you want to go, Marius?
Yes, yes, that's definitely something that can be done. I mean, timber in general, when it is sustainably sourced, it is a low carbon material. And it is a low carbon material when it is also locally sourced. So we also need to take that into account. There are countries that have an abundance of supply, for example, Finland, Sweden, and several other countries, mostly in the European North. And in this case, I mean, you could definitely consider timber. There are some other countries where timber is, the timber supply is just not enough. And I think the market will find its balance on its own. So when you're not able to find locally sourced timber and it has to travel like 3,000 kilometers, and you need to take into account the transportation impacts, maybe it doesn't worth it in the end. But this is something that you need to assess with a life cycle assessment. So it is also something that you need to do at an early stage, like explore what is your local supply of timber. If there's no local supply, say where is this coming from? For example, for an Italian project or a Greek project, is it coming from Finland? Then make sure that you do take into account the transportation impacts. And if together with transportation impacts, the overall results are higher than a locally sourced concrete, or in the case of steel, then you might want to reconsider. Biogenic carbon itself is taken into account according to the European standard for construction EPDs, the EN 15804. So the biogenic carbon is always reported separately, because you get the benefit at the very beginning. I mean, in some very simplistic terms, you take the benefit initially with the absorption of CO2, but at the end of the building's life, this CO2 is emitted back to the atmosphere in a different form, in the form of methane, for example. So it is best practice, or the only practice currently with the standards, to report it separately and consider it separately. I don't know if Paul, you want to.
Yeah, well, I think certainly timber will play a really big role, and indeed other biogenic-based materials also ought to as well. I think we mustn't get carried away and try to shoehorn in timber solutions where they're not appropriate, as you said. So whether that's because of transport issues, or frankly they're just not a suitable solution. But we certainly should be embracing timber as a significant opportunity. And I think the most important role, in my view, that timber has is to displace more carbon-intensive materials first. The fact that it stores carbon is a significant advantage, but it ought to be recognised in an entirely separate way, in my view, and potentially even targeted in a different way as well. So yeah, I think timber is a really valuable part of the future to solve this problem, but it's not the only part. And also we need to be recognised that although it's sustainable, we don't have an infinite supply of timber to displace other materials right now. So we do need to make sure we use it carefully.
Thank you. So let's take one final question from Phil before wrapping it up. Will EPDs play a less prominent role for construction products if the environmental indicators will be declared on the DOPC in accordance with the new CPR?
I'm not too sure on that one, I'll be totally frank. Marius, I don't know if you can answer that.
I think that there is a confusion with the different terms. So in the case of EPDs, we're talking about the declaration of environmental impacts at a product level. And in the case of EPBD, we're talking about declaration of building scale impacts. I think you mentioned CPR in the question, which is basically the construction products regulation, which require all construction products to report on certain environmental impacts and other impacts as well. To my understanding, an EPD according to 15804 is your best way to declare those impacts. So the CPR is basically a vehicle for forcing manufacturers in Europe, but also importers, to generate EPDs for products used in Europe. So there's definitely no conflict between CPR and EPDs. In fact, the one is driving the other. And in case of EPBD and EPDs, we're talking about two different things. I'm not sure if I got the question right, so I just expanded in two different directions just to be sure.
Thanks, Marius. Yeah, thank you so much, Paul and Marius, both for joining us today for this very valuable and educational presentation. I really enjoyed being here. I hope you all enjoyed as well. And if you would like to contact us, we're always happy to hear from you. Please visit the website or drop us an email at sales@oneclicklc.com. Thank you and see you next time. And thank you, Paul and Marius, again for joining today.
Thank you, Asa. Bye-bye,
Thank you.
everyone.